Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We aim to reduce our impact on the environment where possible through a focus on renewable energy and recycled product. Assalamu alaikum. Today I will present the topic under kind supervision of Professor Dr. Saira Afzal, environmental risk and impact assessment. Learning outline of my presentation is introduction about these risk, environmental risk assessment, ecological risk assessment, and environmental impact assessment. Recent updates, and at the end, there is an MCQ session. At the end of this presentation, participants will be able to describe importance of environmental ecological risk assessment and environmental impact assessment. First, we introduced environmental risk assessment. An environmental risk assessment is a document that outlines the health risk associated with exposure to environmental contaminants at a site and provide the justification for taking action to remediate or remove the contamination. There are different approaches that are used for environmental risk assessment. We formalize the approach estimating the magnitude of harm from some condition, and then there is objective information and inform public policy, which leads toward inform public policy decision. Damage to natural or artificial ecosystem, wildlife species, and endangered species. This is known as ecological risk assessment, where human viability is at risk. These are the differences between environmental risk assessment and ecological risk assessment. Human health risks are studied. Environmental toxicology and exposure is assessed. There may be a carcinogenic effect or a non-carcinogenic effect. Damage to natural and artificial ecosystem, wildlife, and endangered species. Toxicology is assessed, and probability of extinction of species or population due to chance or population or likelihood that exotic species will become invasive. How we do a risk management? There are different steps for in the risk management: action taken to overcome risk, policy decision that set standard for contaminants in air, water, soil, or food, like identify, evaluate, control, implement, monitor, and awareness. These are the steps that are used in the risk management. Environmental risk assessment. There are 4-step approach that are used in the risk assessment: hazard identification, dose response assessment, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. First is hazard identification. The initial investigation of a site, neighborhood, or area usually include collecting samples and identify potential sources of suspected risk. The samples are analyzed to identify concentration for a comprehensive range of suspected risk. Second one is dose response assessment. In a dose response assessment, there is a graphical representation. In this zone, there is a no effect range. And when you increase the dose, range of increasing effect with increasing dose are seen. And then there is a stage where a maximum effect range is shown in any hazard to the environment. Exposure assessment. In exposure assessment, we basically estimate the exposure to a target population, the contact of exposure, bioavailability, absorption of that exposure, estimate of a dose to a target organ. There are different concentration of a substance that are estimated, like air, water, food, soil, and the route of exposure. These all are the route of exposure is inhalation, ingestion, or a skin absorption. Then comes the 4th phase, which is risk characterization. And in the risk characterization, we can do a quantitative estimate of a exposure level at which a particular level of excess risk exists. This is the grading of the risk characterization. Uh, in this, there is a negligible. Number 2 is assigned for a minor. Number 3 is assigned for a moderate category. Number 4 is for a major category, and number 5 is for a catastrophic. And in this, there is a rare, unlikely, possible, likely, or almost certain. And then, if you measure any hazard, then you give the number according to that categories. ALARA. ALARA stands for as low as reasonably achievable. ALARA means avoiding exposure to radiation that does not have a direct benefit to you, even if the dose is small. To do this, you can use 3 basic protective measures in radiation safety: time, distance, and shielding. Control emission by best available technology control. Acceptable risk. Environmental risk assessment is to identify whether particular exposure level is acceptable to a target population. These are the range where you accepted the risk, broadly acceptable region. And then this is the region of a tolerable, when you tolerate any risk. But in the end, there is a zone in which the risk is unacceptable, and this is the maximum tolerable risk. Risk assessment of non-cancer endpoint. There are 4 phases: no observed adverse effect level, lowest observed adverse effect level, reference dose and uncertainty factor, and acceptable daily intake. So this is the no observed adverse effect level, and this is the highest observed adverse effect level: upper confidence level and lower confidence level. There are 2 categories that are used in the risk assessment: NOYAL and LOYAL. In the NOYAL, the no observed adverse effect level is a level of exposure found by experiment at which there is no biological or statistically significant increase in the frequency or severity of any adverse effect, highest point. And the lowest observed adverse effect level is a lowest concentration found by experiment that cause an adverse effect at the lowest point. Reference doses: acceptable level to be exposed to human population without appreciable risk. This is the reference dose. And uncertainty factor: when sufficient human data is not available. NOYAL or LOYAL values derived from measurements in animal or small group of human in order to estimate a NOYAL or LOYAL value for the whole human population. Acceptable daily intake. It is a measure of the amount of a specific substance originally applied for a food additive, later also for a residue of veterinary drug or pesticide in food or drinking water, that can be ingested orally over a lifetime without any appreciable health risk. So this is acceptable daily intake. Now comes the ecological risk assessment. In the ecological risk assessment, we evaluate risk of the ecosystem, and it is quite complex. And there are biotic or abiotic. Again, we also follow a 4-step approach for the ecological risk assessment: hazard identification, dose response assessment, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. There is a difference in the previous risk assessment. In ecological risk assessment, the endpoint of measure are selected. Population viability is of concern. The main concern is population viability and landscape approach. Integrated approach, risk assessment of both human and ecological indicators. When done, then we can say that integrated approach is used for the environmental risk assessment. Now comes the environmental impact assessment. Environmental impact assessment is a process of evaluating the likely environmental impact of a proposed project or development, taking into account interrelated socioeconomic, cultural, and human health impact, both beneficial or adverse. There are different stages of environmental impact assessment. First one is screening to determine which product or development require impact assessment study. Scoping to identify which potential impacts are relevant to assess based on legislative requirement, international convention, expert knowledge, and public involvement. Assessment and evaluation of impact done to establish most environmentally sound and best option for achieving project objectives. Mitigation and management to avoid or minimize predicted adverse effect. Environmental impact report, likely environmental effects of the project, and in the decision making on whether to improve the project or not and under what condition. And then at the end, there is implementation and monitoring. Mitigation, air filter for factories. Caring for the air we breathe is everyone's responsibility. Contributing to creating a clean environment should be a priority in any industrial process. And it does not take any environmental expert to realize that the factories and the industrial processes that take place in them should impact on the environment as little as possible. That is why at Venifier we have a high committed to the environmental clean industrial process and people. So mitigation is a term which is used when we applied air filters for factories. Now it's time for the recent updates. Environmental health. Healthier environment could prevent almost 1/4 of the global burden of disease. The COVID-19 pandemic is a further reminder of the delicate relationship between people and our planet. Clean air, stable climate, adequate water, sanitation and hygiene, safe use of chemicals, protection from radiation, healthy and safe workplace, sound agriculture practices, health supportive cities and built environment, and a preserved nature are all prerequisites for a good health. There is a compendium of the WHO and other United guidance on health and environment. And these compendium estimate a comprehensive collection of about 500 intervention for healthier environment that you can implement at the following areas. WHO says that air pollution is clean, water, sanitation and hygiene is proper, climate change is observed strictly, irradiation, protect from irradiation, do solid waste management properly, nature and health are clean when you plant trees, chemical are disposed of carefully, safe environment and mobility. This is the one of the article which is published, a review of the status of environmental impact assessment in Pakistan. Environmental impact assessment received legal status in Pakistan when the Environmental Protection Ordinance was drafted in 1983. This ordinance was then converted into Pakistan Environmental Protection Act in 1997, and currently environmental impact assessment is conducted for many development projects in Pakistan, including infrastructure and industry projects. This is another article, environmental impact assessment of phosphate fertilizer and phospho-gypsum waste, elemental and radiological effect. For non-carcinogenic risk, the data was fed into human health risk models to evaluate the potential health risk of heavy metals by computing the average daily intake of each pollutant via a variant exposure pathways and subsequent determination of the hazard quotient, hazard index, and total exposure hazard index. For carcinogenic risk, the incremental lifetime cancer risk was calculated. The outcome give rise to that some parameter values are above the acceptable limit. This increase the probability of adverse effect. Now comes the MCQ session. A new building construction material for building new hospital has been proposed, which has more resistance to earthquake than the material being used now. The primary reason for environmental impact assessment is to mitigate existing environmental impact of previous development, calculate the size of impact of previous development, describe proposed development, identify the environmental consequences of development in advance, or environmental impact report.
B.
D.
D is the correct answer. Identify the environmental consequences of development in advance. A researcher is interested to find out adverse effect of smoke on human. For this purpose, he is use a four-step approach. Which of the following is not a hazard identification of smoke in human according to that four-risk approach? Incidence of lung cancer in human, particulate matter 2.5 more than normal, new cases of asthma, number of cases who develop worsening of COPD, incidence of skin cancer in humans.
E.
A.
A is the right answer, incidence of lung cancer in human. A pharmaceutical company is interested in finding novel of a drug for treating fungal infection. The no observed adverse effect level is a level of exposure found by experiment with dose response curve. So NOAL is highest point at which no adverse effect has been observed, lowest point at which no observed adverse effect has been observed, average of highest and lowest point at which no adverse effect has been observed, confidence limit at which no adverse effect has been observed, and lowest point at which adverse effect has been observed.
C.
A is the right answer, highest point at which no adverse effect has been observed. A new drug for treatment of severe COVID pneumonia has been developed. The drug has been used in rats, but human trial has not been done. How can loyal be predicted for the new drug? No observed adverse effect level, uncertainty factor, reference dose, acceptable daily intake, observed adverse effect level.
E.
B is the right answer, uncertainty factor. A new drug for treating invasive breast cancer is in trial. A researcher wants to find out dose at which adverse effects, including nausea, anorexia, and vomiting, are observed. The lowest observed effect level is the highest concentration found by the experiment that cause an adverse effect. Lowest concentration found by experiment that cause an adverse effect. Average concentration found by experiment that cause an adverse effect. Confidence limit found by experiment that cause an adverse effect. Average concentration found by experiment that cause no effect.
A.
A is the right answer. Highest concentration found by experiment that cause an adverse effect. Ecological risk assessment is done for evaluating risk of ecosystem. It is slightly different from human risk assessment because its endpoints measure are determined in hazard identification. Population viability is of concern. Dose response curve are constructed. Risk characterization is done. Population viability is not over concern.
B.
B is the right answer because there is ecological risk assessment, so population viability is of our concern. The aim of environmental risk assessment is risk characterization. Risk characterization is the quantitative estimate of exposure level at which a particular level of excess risk exists. Qualitative estimate of exposure level at which a particular level of excess risk exists. Qualitative estimate of exposure level at which a particular level of reduced risk exists. Quantitative estimate of only inhaled level at which a particular level of excess risk exists, and a qualitative estimate of only inhaled level at which particular level of excess risk exists.
B.
A quantitative estimate of exposure level at which a particular level of excess risk exists. Arsenic in water is high around Indus Valley civilization in Pakistan. Amount of level that can be consumed daily during lifetime without any appreciable risk is no observed adverse effect level, lowest observed adverse effect level, uncertainty factor, acceptable daily intake, or a reference dose.
D.
D is the right answer, acceptable daily intake. A new pharmaceutical industry is proposed to be built in Pakistan so that more drug can be manufactured locally to reduce the cost of drug in a market. Environmental impact assessment is necessary prior to the construction. Screening is the first step which determine possible adverse environmental effect of project. To determine which project or development require impact assessment study, to improve the project or not, and under what condition, to explore alternative of the project.
A.
A.
To determine which product or development require impact assessment study, B is the right answer. A new industry for manufacturing hospital surgical instrument has been proposed. The industry will be use fuel for operating plant, which is vital for instrument development. This will increase carbon emission, but emission are less than the alternative options available. What should be done? Start project as hospital surgical instrument are important. Don't start project as it is hazardous to environment. Mitigate effect by installing filter and planting trees. Wait for advanced technology, run the industry, no need of intervention.
C.
C is the right answer, mitigate effect by installing filter and planting trees. This is the key of my MCQs, a YouTube link of my presentation, and thank you.